Today we're taking a bit of a detour from the topic of Saint Germain to cover the real identity of Shakespeare, which is assumed to be Francis Bacon. Now I know this is an old topic that's been covered extensively, but there's some very interesting information that I never knew about until reading a book as obscure as this one. In Freemasonry, the Shakespeare plays are a monumental point in history because it's when modern Freemasonry really began to be ushered in. It's also when we switched from monarchies to democracies. And the Shakespeare plays really helped that happen, which in my opinion is a good thing. I don't trust bloodlines and kings and queens to run the population. However, the negative change that occurred is that Freemasons went from operating in a hierarchical sense below the monarchy to where they are at today, which is above and beyond the democracy. So let's see how some of that took place, and in the notion once and for all that the man from Stratford wrote these plays. We shall present evidence in this chapter to prove that the man who acted the Shakespeare plays was not the man who wrote them. Now, to differentiate between the true author of the plays and the man who acted them, we shall spell the name of the later Shakespeare as it appears on his will, and the true author of the play Shakespeare as it appears on the title pages of the quartos and folios of the plays. This difference in spelling has been disregarded by most Shakespearean students as an insignificant error, but in reality it has the utmost significance, for it serves to differentiate between the actor of the plays and their true author. There is a yawning gap between the dramatic author of the Shakespeare plays and the actor from Stratford, a gap which no scholar has ever bridged. The author of the plays and the sonnets, passing under Shakespeare's name, represented the sum of the learning of his time, a man well versed in matters of statesmanship, in court etiquette, in history, law, navigation, philosophy, foreign language, natural science, and he held revolutionary views in medicine, was keenly interested in morbid psychology, and was a scholar of the Bible. On the other hand, the actor William Shakespeare was an untaught, ignorant, unlearned man, a drunkard, and profligate. He was a child of an illiterate family. Neither his father nor mother knew how to read or write, nor did his children. His father, John Shakespeare, a councilman of Stratford, had to sign official documents with a mark. His daughter Judith, at the age of 27, was still illiterate and could not sign her name except with a cross. There are in existence only 6 known examples of Shakespeare's handwriting. All are signatures, and 3 of them are in his will. In the opinion of those who have studied their scrawling on certain letters, they indicate that the writer was unfamiliar with the use of a pen, and that he either copied a signature prepared for him or his hand was guided while he wrote. This is reasonable to believe in the view of the very scanty education he received and the absence of books in Stratford, where he spent his youth. Shakespeare's family was totally uneducated. He was the first of his family who could read or write. His father and mother, grandfathers and grandmothers, aunts and cousins all signed their names with crosses. William Shakespeare was born in a little village of Stratford-on-Avon in 1564. Stratford has been called a bookless neighborhood. His education, if he received any at all, was the most elementary and did not go beyond the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. However, according to Manly Hall, literally and factually, it is exceedingly doubtful that any school existed in Stratford until after Shakespeare's death, and there is no proof of any kind that William Shakespeare learned to read or write while in Stratford, or for that matter, anywhere else. It is generally admitted that Shakespeare was a man without education and without learning. Pope speaks of him as a man with no education. Voltaire called him a drunken savage. Ben Jonson said that he possessed small Latin and less Greek, while Fuller said that his learning was very little. Richard Grant White wrote that Shakespeare was regarded, even down to the time of Pope, as a bewitching and untutored and half-savage child of nature. He was looked upon as a rustic-bred bard who sung as birds sing, a greater Burns. Reverend John Ward, Victor of Stratford, writing 47 years after Shakespeare's death and speaking of the traditions of his village, said, "I have heard that Mr. Shakespeare was a natural wit without any art at all." 70-odd years after Shakespeare's passing, Bentham, in his State of the English Schools and Churches, wrote, "William Shakespeare was born at Stratford in Warwickshire. His learning was very little, and therefore it is more a matter of wonder that he should be a very excellent poet." Did William Shakespeare possess such a vast amount of information as was necessary in order to write the plays attributed to his authorship? If so, how did he acquire it? If there is nothing in his life to indicate that he was fitted or qualified to possess such an education or knowledge, only a miracle could explain the discrepancies between his life and his supposed works. We have mentioned that his family was uneducated and illiterate, and his father could not read or write, and that all members of his family signed their names with crosses, he being the only one to sign his signature. The whole population of Stratford were densely ignorant, and the village was bookless. Their lives were coarse, barren, and filthy. It was indeed by a miracle that if out of this vulgar, dirty, illiterate family came the greatest genius that had adorned the annuals of the human race. It is possible. It is scarcely probable. There was nothing in the life of the actor Shakespeare pointing to outstanding mental qualities which distinguish him from his fellow citizens. Not one of the many brilliant men of his age made mention of the fact that they knew him or were on friendly terms with him, or that they honored him as a man of letters. No historian has ever explained how the Stratford actor, who early deserted his wife and family, taking with him but his Warwickshire dialect, which was not understood in London, and after coming there could produce after a short residence at the capital such a finished and flawless literary masterpiece as the plays that go by his name. Shakespeare died in Stratford in 1616 without a single book in his possession, nor a manuscript he had written, nor original copies of the plays he had perfected. Concerning his will, which mentions the articles of clothing he left behind, but not any books in his possession, Mark Twain comments, "It is eminently and conspicuously a businessman's will, not a poet's. It mentioned not a single book. Books were much more precious than swords and silver-gilt bowls and second-best beds in those days. And when a departing person owned one, he gave it a high place in his will. The will mentioned not a play, not a poem, not an unfinished literary work, not a scrap of manuscript of any kind." Many poets died poor, but this is the one and only in history that died this poor. Others all left literary remains behind, but this one did not. The facts concerning Shakespeare's life are very meager. The chief incidents of his youth were his becoming a butcher's apprentice at a young age, his lying unconscious all night in the fields in a state of drunkenness, and his deer stealing on the property of Sir Thomas Lucy, who had him whipped. In order to revenge himself, he composed the following rude and vulgar ballad about Sir Lucy, which only redoubled in prosecution against him, so much so that he was forced to leave his employment and family and shelter himself in London. Even though it is supposed to have been the very first poetic attempt, how the writer of the following could be identified with the writer of the Shakespeare plays is incredible. A Parliament member, a justice of peace, at home a poor scarecrow, at London an ass. If Lucy is Lucy, as some folks miscall it, then Lucy is Locy, whatever befall it. He thinks himself great, yet an ass is his state. We allow by his ears, with some asses to mate. If Lucy is Locy, as some folks miscall it, sing Locy Lucy, whatever befall it. Shakespeare's youth was not spent in the atmosphere of libraries and books, but at drinking bouts. After an affair with a young lady, Anne Hathaway, as the result of which she became pregnant, the two families got together and decided that in deference of public opinion, it would be appropriate for Willie and Annie to marry prior to the birth of the child. Shakespeare unwillingly consented, but at the first opportunity left her and the child without support and fled to London to join a band of vagabonds and adventurers who gathered around the playhouses. Here he eked out his existence by holding horses' heads outside the theater in the company of ruffians, thieves, apprentices, pimps, and prostitutes. Stormy, dirty, quarrelsome lot that gathered there. He organized a group of assistants who were afterwards known as Shakespeare's Boys. Gradually he worked his way to become a callboy and later an actor. After a number of years in London, Shakespeare returned to Stratford with plenty of money and bought one of the best houses in town, becoming a practical businessman. Among his business activities was brewing, for which on one occasion he was known to have bought a considerable quantity of hops, which business he carried on into his residence at New Place. He also lent money at unusually high interest rates, and there are records of the assumed author of Shakespeare suing a local townsman for the loan of 2 shillings which he failed to return. In 1604, Shakespeare sued Philip Rogers, according to court records, for several bushels of malt sold to him at various times. He also attempted to enter gentry under false pretenses. The closing years of his life were uneventful except for some participation in local politics, and the first recorded fact in reference to the Stratford boy was a drunken bout in which he lost consciousness and lay in the fields all night, so the history of his life terminates with the same event, for he died in a barroom brawl. When Shakespeare died, he left no books and no library. If he did, there is not the slightest trace of it, for his will makes no mention of it. The man who wrote the plays would have loved his library, and would have remembered it to his last hours. He could not have forgotten his Plutarch, Ovid, and Homer, to remember in his will the second best bed with the furniture, his broad silver and gilt bowl, his sword, and his wearing apparel. The old man of Stratford forgot his Homer and Plato, but his mind dwelt lovingly at the edge of his grave on his old breeches and second-hand bedclothes. However, according to some writers, this is not surprising, for since he never owned a single book, he could not have left any. According to Donnelly, there is no evidence that Shakespeare possessed a single book. The man who was supposed to have been the greatest literary genius in modern times passed on leaving no letters, no books, no library, making no mention of such in his will. Nor does there remain any evidence of the debris of his workshop, and no original copies of the plays. There can be little doubt that the man who wrote the Shakespeare plays, in contradiction with the person just described, was the most eminent scholar of his day, well versed in the literature of classical and modern times. The plays indicate that their author read Greek and Latin authors in the original. The greater part of the story of Timon from Athens was taken from the untranslated Greek of Lucian, according to Holmes, while White claims that the plays show 40% Romance or Latin words. Knight notes that the three Roman plays show a profound understanding of the whole range of Roman history. Moreover, the plays show that their author was a classical scholar who had read Sophocles, Ovid, Horace, Virgil, Lucretius, Euripides, and Aeschylus, and other Greek and Latin writers. Some see evidence in the plays that their author was a close student of Plato. In addition to scholarly knowledge of classical literature, there is evidence that the writer of the plays was well versed in the languages and literature of France, Italy, and Spain. Another fact of interest is that evidence of scholarship marked the earliest as well as the latest works of the great poet. White says that the early plays show a man fresh from academic studies. On this point, Donnelly, in his great cryptogram, a voluminous work devoted to proving the Baconian authorship of the plays, writes, "The author of the plays, whoever he may have been, was unquestionably a profound scholar and most laborious student. He had read in their own tongues all the great and some of the obscure writers of antiquity. He was familiar with the languages and principal nations of Europe. His mind had compassed all the learning of his time and of preceding ages. He had pored over the pages of French and Italian novelists. He had read the philosophical utterance of the great thinkers of Greece and Rome. He had closely considered the narrations of the explorers who were just laying bare the secrets of new islands and continents. It has been justly said that the plays could not have been written without a library, and cannot today be studied without one. To their proper elucidation, the learning of the whole world is necessary." Goethe says of the writer of the plays, he drew a sponge over the table of human knowledge. Did William Shakespeare possess such vast mass of information? Could he have possessed it? The answer is clearly no. There is nothing in the life of William Shakespeare known that indicates that he was fitted or qualified to possess such education or knowledge. Only a miracle could explain the discrepancies between his life and his supposed works. The plays indicate that their author had traveled widely and was familiar with the customs, social conditions, geography, and politics of innumerable countries, but there is no record that Shakespeare ever left England prior to writing the plays. The plays could only have been written by a lawyer or by one who had legal training and profound knowledge of academic law, both theoretical and practical. There is nothing to indicate that Shakespeare had such training. Francis Bacon was a lawyer. The plays were written by one who had intimate knowledge of the court of England, court usage, and the psychology of aristocracy, but it is extremely unlikely that the Stratford boy had any such knowledge or intimate contact with a sphere so far from his own. The author had an exceptional grasp on the great philosophies of the world, especially the Platonic and Aristotelian, and was himself a proficient interpreter of philosophical systems. There is no reason to believe that Shakespeare had such erudition. The author of the Shakespeare plays had revolutionary political opinions and views of governmental reform. A humble actor or playwright could not be expected to have such views in those days. It is clear that some unknown scholar whose learning was encyclopedic and whose station and personal taste fitted him for such a work was the creator of the plays. The only scholar of this type who lived in England at this time was Francis Bacon. There is every reason to believe that the author of the plays was a man of large learning, that he had read and studied Homer, Plato, Sophocles, Euripides, Horace, Virgil, Lucretius, Statius, Catullus, Seneca, Ovid, Plautus, Plutarch, and Boccaccio, and an innumerable number of French, Spanish, and Danish writers. And since there were no public libraries in that day to which he could resort, he must have possessed a large library and gathered around him a literary store commensurate with his own intellectual activity. There is no evidence that Shakespeare had such a library, for if he did, he would have surely mentioned it in his will. Another unusual circumstance is the fact that the great literary genius should have permitted his daughter Judith to have grown up and reached the age of 27 without knowing how to read or write. On this point, Donnelly in his book The Great Cryptogram writes, "It is not surprising that William Shakespeare, poacher, fugitive, vagabond, actor, manager, brewer, moneylender, land-grabber, should permit one of his 2 children to grow up in gross ignorance, but it is beyond the compass of the human mind to believe that the author of Hamlet and Lear could have done so." Another matter difficult to understand is how the Stratford boy, coming from a backward town which had no libraries and there was no access to books, and arriving in London where he became a horse-holder, could have suddenly acquired the tremendous learning with which the author of the plays certainly possessed. There was nothing in his new London surroundings that even remotely resembled Greek, Latin, French, Italian, Spanish, and Danish literature and studies, or medical, musical, or philosophical researches. Neither did he come to London with such acquirements from his Stratford background, where his life was spent in a reckless, improvident, dissipated, and disregarded manner in saloons rather than in libraries. From all available records, the young Shakespeare is not represented as a studious youth who spent his boyhood in a garret, devouring the works of the classical authors and dwelling in a world of thought and high aspirations, but his boyhood was spent as a butcher boy, a deer stealer, and in the company of drunkards. There is not a single tradition to indicate any element of studiousness in the boy's character, a fact which is unusual in biographies of geniuses, all whom demonstrated their superior mental traits in their youth. Commenting on this fact, Donnelly writes, "Only a miracle of studiousness could have acquired in a few years, upon a basis of total ignorance and bad habits, the culture and refinement in the earliest of plays. But a few years elapsed between the time when he fled Stratford and the time when the plays began to appear in his name in London. But the plays now believed to have been written by the same hand that wrote the Shakespeare plays were on the board before he left Stratford. The twins, Judith and Hamlet, were born in February 1585, Shakespeare being then not yet 21 years of age, and we will see hereafter Hamlet appears for the first time in 1585 or 1587. If he had shown anywhere in his career such a trait of immense industry and scholarly research, some tradition would have reached us concerning it. We have traditions that he was the father of another man's son, and we are told of a licentious amour in which he outwitted Burbage, and we hear of wet combats in a tavern, but not one word comes down to us about books, of study, of industry, or art. The author of the plays was a lawyer, poet, philosopher, scientist, and a reformer. Francis Bacon was a lawyer, poet, philosopher, scientist, and a reformer. Bacon had learning, industry, ambition for immortality. That is quite relevant to the Saint Germain story. Command of language in all its heights and depths, the power of compressing thought into condensed sentences, wit, fancy, imagination, feeling, and the temperament of a genius. It is an interesting fact that Stratford-upon-Avon was never mentioned in the plays, while St. Albans, Bacon's home, is mentioned many times, indicating that the author had more intimate personal acquaintanceship with this region than with Stratford. The historical plays center around St. Alban as a common center. The plays indicate that their author was an aristocrat who despised the class to which Shakespeare belonged. He was also a philanthropist, which Shakespeare was not. His writings indicated that he belonged to the Essex faction and disliked Coke, Cecil, and Queen Elizabeth, as did Francis Bacon. Bacon regarded the drama as a great potential instrument for good. He said dramatic poetry is history made visible. He hoped through the drama to prepare the public mind for the advent of a new democratic era, which his secret Freemasonic societies were actively engaged in bringing into manifestation. Accordingly, Bacon took part in the preparation of many plays and masques for the entertainment of the court, some of which were acted by Shakespeare's company of players. This he did while a young struggling lawyer when stricken with poverty in order to earn some more money. His foster mother, Lady Bacon, disapproved of her son writing plays, which was looked down upon by something unworthy of his talents. This was one reason why he concealed the fact by writing under assumed names. But there was much more important reason why he concealed this fact, namely his fear of persecution by Elizabeth for his indirect criticism of the English government which the historical Shakespeare plays veiled. Bacon was opposed to royal despotism. He showed as a leader of the people in the House of Commons that he was ready to use the power of Parliament to restrain the unlimited arrogance of the crown. He saw that one great obstacle to liberty was the popular idea of the divine right of kings. We can hardly believe today the full force of this sentiment as it existed then. Hence in the plays he labors to reduce the king to the level of other men or below them. He represented John as a cowardly knave, a truckler to a foreign power, a would-be murderer, and an altogether worthless creature. Richard II he represented as a little better, a frivolous, weak-witted, corrupt, sordid, dishonest fool. Surely this must have sounded strange in the ears of a London audience of the 16th century who had been taught to regard the king as anointed from heaven and the actual vice-regent of God on earth, whose very touch was capable of working miracles in the cure of disease. And the play concludes with the murder of Richard. Then came Henry IV, usurper and murderer who confesses to his own crookedness and establishes a dynasty on the murder of Richard II. His son, Henry V, is the best of the lot. He is the hero king, but even he rises out of a shameful youth. He is the associate of the most degraded, the companion of profligate men and women, of highwaymen and pickpockets. In his mouth the poet puts the declaration of the hollowness of royal pretenses. In the Shakespearean play of Richard III, he depicted him as a horrible monster, a wild beast, a liar, a perjurer, a monster, a remorseless, bloody, man-eating tiger of the jungles. In Henry VIII, we have a king who divorced a sainted angel to marry a frivolous woman under the domination of the incitements of sensual passion. In short, throughout the historical Shakespeare plays, Bacon tried to teach the common people that kings were nothing more than men, made from the same clay and ruled by the same passions, that heaven did not ordain them nor protect them, and that a king has no right to hold his throne any longer than he behaves himself. Was this not a revolutionary idea to put forth in that day? These plays had the hidden purpose of educating the English people and preparing them for the day when Charles I was brought to trial and to the scaffold. These histories of the English kings led to the Revolution and the constitutional government in place of the monarchy and despotism that led to the birth of a new democratic age, which was ushered in by Bacon's Freemasonic Society. It is clear that the plays were written by a humanitarian and political reformer and not simply by a poet. It is interesting to note that the Shakespeare plays appeared when Bacon was poor and working for bread, and that after he obtained place and wealth, they ceased to be produced, although Shakespeare still lived in Stratford and continued to be there for 10 years more. One reason why Bacon kept his authorship of the plays secret, besides the fact that his life would be in danger if the real seditious purpose discovered, was that he aspired to the position his foster father, Nicholas Bacon, held as Lord Chancellor of the kingdom. And if he was known to have been the author of the plays, this would have stood in the way of his political aspirations. Another fact should be borne in mind. Francis Bacon was greedy for knowledge. He ranged the whole amphitheater of human learning, from Greece, Rome, Italy, France, Spain, the early English writers. He gathered facts and thoughts. He had his promise, his commonplace book of notes. His writings teem with quotations from the poets. And yet not once does he refer to William Shakespeare or the Shakespeare writings. The man of Stratford acted in one of the plays that go by his name, and on the same night, in the same place, is presented a masque written by Bacon. Thus we have two men under the same roof at the same time engaged in the same kind of work. Shakespeare the actor and Bacon the masque writer thus rubbed elbows, but neither seemed to know each other. Landor said, Bacon knew little or suspected there was then existing his superior in intellectual knowledge. That is, granted that Shakespeare did write the plays that go by his name, which he did not. Bacon wrote the plays when he was in dire financial circumstances as a poor lawyer. It was customary for impecunious lawyers in that age to earn money by writing for the stage. While quite young, Bacon assisted in getting up a play for his law school at Gray's Inn, if he did not write the greater part of it. It was called The Comedy of Errors, which then appeared at Gray's Inn for the first time and was acted by Shakespeare's company. Bacon and Shakespeare then met each other, since they were both on boards of Gray's Inn at the time. One is a writer of the play, and the other directed. After this meeting with Shakespeare, Bacon decided to use him as a mask for other plays he wrote, which permitted him to freely express his revolutionary ideas without endangering his social and political aspirations by doing so. and at the same time it enabled him to keep out of poverty. Hence his cooperation with the actor Shakespeare in this manner had everything in its favor. That Shakespeare could not have written the Shakespearean plays is indicated by the fact that the appearance of the plays antedated his coming to London, which is believed to have occurred in 1587. Yet that high authority Richard Simpson in his School of Shakespeare showed that the Shakespeare plays started to appear in 1585. In other words, while Shakespeare was still living in Stratford and the year his twins were born, plays under the name of Shakespeare started appearing in London. Are we to believe that in that bookless neighborhood, the butcher's apprentice between his whippings, deer stealing, and beer guzzling was writing plays for the stage? That would be a miracle indeed. In 1587, the very year when he came to London, and while he was probably holding horses at the front door of the theater, Shakespeare's plays of Hamlet were being acted, and were believed by other playwrights to have been composed by some lawyer. And not only did the plays attributed to Shakespeare first make their appearance while he was in Stratford whipped and persecuted by Sir Thomas Lucy, and subsequently while he was a groom for the visitors at the playhouse, but at the same time, we are told, he not only supplied his own theater, but with extraordinary fecundity, he furnished plays to every company of actors in London. Is it possible that while employed as a callboy in one company, he furnished plays to other rival companies? Would his profits not have lifted him above the necessity of acting as a groom or callboy if he had done so? Is it not more probable that the lawyer mentioned above as author of Hamlet also supplied other theaters with his voluminous literary productions? Now another dilemma confronts us, for not only is Shakespeare supposed to have written plays acted on the London stage before he came to London, when he was whipped as a deer stealer, but after he returned to Stratford with ample leisure and opportunity to make money by writing more plays, never wrote a single one, but instead is known to have engaged in such things as suing his neighbors for a few shillings of malt sold, while he, who we are led to believe was the most fecund of human intelligences, remained idly in his native village, writing nothing, doing nothing, vegetating for 5 to 10 years among much heaps and filthy ditches, until he died in a drunken brawl. Could the author of Hamlet and King Lear, the profound scholarly philosopher, be capable of such a mental suicide, such a living death during the 5 to 10 years which time he did not write a single play, not a letter, not a syllable, nothing but 3 ignorant-looking signatures to a will when his hand seems to have been guided by his lawyer, since the testator unaided did not seem capable of writing his own name, in which document he mentioned his bedclothes, but not a single book? Another singular fact, from 1592 to 1598, 8 editions of the plays which now go by the name of Shakespeare were published, without his name or any other name on the title page. Romeo and Juliet, Richard II, Richard III, all printed in 1597, were without the name Shakespeare, or anyone else on the title page. It was not until the publication of Love's Labour Lost in 1598 that we find his name set forth as having a connection with this play, and even then, he does not claim to be the author of it. The title page reads, "As it was presented before Her Highness this last Christmas, newly corrected and augmented by W. Shakespeare." During the same year, the tragedy of Richard II is published, and the name of William Shakespeare appears as the author. In his voluminous work, The Great Cryptogram, Ignatius Donnelly lists hundreds of identical expressions, identical metaphors, opinions, quotations, use of unusual words, studies, errors, identity of character, and identities of style between the author of Shakespeare's plays and Bacon's writings, covering almost 200 pages. Donnelly says Bacon was ravaging all time and searching the face of the whole earth for gems of thought and expression, and here in these plays was a veritable Golconda of jewels under his very nose, and he seems not to have known it. Perhaps the greatest revelation of the Baconian authorship of the plays is in the Northumberland House manuscript. In 1867, there was discovered in the library of the Northumberland House in London a remarkable manuscript containing copies of several papers written by Francis Bacon. It was found in a box of old papers which had long remained undisturbed. There is the title page, which embraces a table of contents of the volume, and this contains the names of writings unquestionably Bacon's, but also the names of plays which are supposed to have been written by Shakespeare. But only one part of the manuscript volume remains, and the portions lost embrace the following pieces enumerated in the title leaf. Orations at Gray's Inn, Queen Mat by Mr. Francis Bacon, Essays by the same author. Richard II, Richard III, Asmund and Cornelia, Isle of Dogs. Judge Holmes, in the authorship of Shakespeare, commenting on this, says, among these scribblings, besides the name of Francis Bacon several times, the name of William Shakespeare is written 8 to 9 times over. We may note that the name of William Shakespeare is spelled as it is in the published quartos, and not as the man himself spelled it as Shakespeare. While we find this name in Bacon's private papers, we find no mention of it in his published writings to indicate that he knew William Shakespeare ever existed. It is clear that Francis Bacon possessed all the literary qualifications required to produce the dramatic works attributed to the actor of William Shakespeare. Popular to the popular opinion that Bacon was only a prose writer of philosophical works, it is in fact that he was a poet. Among the acknowledged writings of Bacon is a poetic paraphrase of some of the Psalms. He is also known to have been the author of a poem entitled The World's a Bubble. In a letter to a friend, Mr. Davis, he beseeches him to be good to concealed poets. In his appendix to Stowe's Annuals, Howes lists in order of prominence the poets that flourished at the time of Queen Elizabeth. He not only mentions Bacon's name on the list, but gives it preference to that of William Shakespeare. Now it is curious that a man who was ranked as a poet above Shakespeare by a historian of the times should have left no important poetic works. The answer to this riddle becomes clear when we consider that Bacon published anonymously or under a pseudonym. Significant is the phrase by Ben Jonson that faces the title page of the early Shakespeare folios. Reader, look not at his picture, but at his book. Writing on the relation between Bacon the author and William Shakespeare the actor, Manly Hall, in his book above referred to, writes, amongst the grist that came from Bacon's mill was a certain country bumpkin, one Willie Shakespeare. This ambitious lad from the shires arrived in London penniless and unknown, but with an obliging temper. Such qualities suited Bacon's plans to a nicety. Here was a youth who longed for fame and lacked the qualities of greatness, a would-be actor whose opinion no one would take too seriously, an obscure mouthpiece not worthy of being tried for treason, even if guilty of something which resembled it. Always it had been the privilege of mountebanks to laugh at kings, but for courtiers such hilarity is fatal. So Willie Shakespeare emerged in print as William Shakespeare. He became the symbol of Pallas Athena, the goddess of wisdom who brandished her spear against the dark creatures of the world of ignorance and fear. It is quite improbable that Francis Bacon alone, unaided, produced all the plays published under the name of William Shakespeare, or later attributed to him. They were the product of Bacon's Parnassian Empire, gathered, arranged, and vitalized by his personality, and each directly related to some problem of Bacon's complex mental nature. Many of the plays were drawn from older sources or compiled from fragments of contemporary dramas, but each was reclothed and repurposed. Each contained the secret story of Bacon's life and tragedy. In 1902, there was published a judicial summing up of the Shakespeare-Bacon controversy by Lord Penzance, a judge of the High Court of London. He wrote as a judge, impartially summing up a case for the jury as to whether Shakespeare was the author of the plays published in the first folio in 1623. He says this is the first thing to be decided before going into the question whether Bacon was the author. He ends by quoting parallel passages from Bacon and Shakespeare plays, which he says is my own opinion the most important matter bearing on the probability that these plays came in truth from the hand of Francis Bacon. This summing up destroys any reasonable doubt that William Shakespeare wrote the plays. Concerning the actor Shakespeare, he says that excluding 5 signatures of his, there is not a single scrap of his writings in existence. None of the plays were entered at the Sanctioners' Hall as required by law in the name of William Shakespeare or by anyone on his behalf. As additional evidence that Shakespeare could not have written the plays, but rather that he was an ignorant man, is the fact that there is no mention in Shakespeare's will of any manuscripts, print or play, or in any books. Also, the folio of 1623 appeared 7 years after his death in 1616, without any authority from Shakespeare or his executors or any of his family, which would indicate that perhaps the real author of the plays, who was interested in preserving them, was responsible for the appearance of the folio. Also, Judge Penzance points out that the folio contains some 20 additional plays never before published, some of them never having been heard of before, which would indicate that the writer of both of the known plays and the new ones must have been someone else than Shakespeare, who was then dead for some years. He adds, "It has been made plain and cannot be disputed that William Shakespeare was in truth, when he left home for London, an almost uneducated man. That these marvelous dramas should have been written by a man of deficient education is, of course, absolutely beyond the reach of possibility. In the year 1587, William Shakespeare fled from Stratford an ignorant youth, destitute of scholarly attainments, and by the year 1593, his name was attached to plays teeming with erudite learning. But the studies and labors of the man who wrote these plays does not stop here. He had made himself competent to read and appreciate the Italian and French languages, as well as Greek and Latin. To believe that the Stratford ignoramus, who knew little Latin and less Greek, could have written these intellectual masterpieces, says Judge Penzance, makes a considerable demand of your credulity." The judge goes on to say the writer of the Shakespeare plays had a knowledge so perfect and so intimate of English law that he was never incorrect and never at fault. This is in accordance with the fact that their author, Francis Bacon, was a lawyer. Lord Campbell, another English judge, in his Shakespeare's Legal Acquirements, emphasizes the same point, saying that Shakespeare uniformly lays down good law, but there is no evidence that the Stratford youth ever worked in a law office, and even the supporters of Shakespeare admit that the idea of him ever having been a law clerk has been blown to pieces. Lord Penzance, after an impartial and thorough investigation of the question whether Shakespeare or Bacon wrote the Shakespeare plays, disposes of the theory that the actor wrote them, and is convinced that Bacon did. His high position in the intellectual world and impartiality as a judge gives strong support to the Baconian theory. G. White, in his Life and Genius of Shakespeare, after quoting a list of eminent Englishmen at the time he lived, says there is no proof whatever that he was personally known to them or to any others of less note among the statesmen, scholars, soldiers, and artists of his day. However, White does include Bacon. Ben Jonson also gives a list of prominent wits of his time, but omits Shakespeare, though including Bacon. When Bacon died, or rather underwent a feigned death prior to his departure for Germany, where he continued his work for humanity under the name of Valentine Andreas, who is the author of The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosicrucian, which is one of the three founding works for Rosicrucianism. Nevertheless, when he died, the greatest scholars of the day united to acclaim him as the greatest poet that ever lived. Did they say this because they knew he had written the Shakespeare plays? They must have known this, since under the name of Francis Bacon, he wrote no poetry except for one or two translations. But Bacon himself never revealed the secret of his authorship of these Shakespeare plays, except in the cipher story hidden in the plays themselves, just as he never admitted that he was the prince of the House of Tudor and the heir to the English throne. Now, just a quick side note, Bacon performing a feigned death, while it's very likely, it's certainly not confirmed historically, and that he was the author of The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosicrucian. Again, pretty likely, but there could have been another guy named Valentine Andreas who actually wrote that. And there's another claim here that's not historically provable, and that is that he is a prince of the House of Tudor. The above evidence should convince any unbiased reader that Francis Bacon was the true author of the Shakespeare plays, and that this is not a matter of mere belief, but is supposed by indisputable evidence, which we will now summarize. Edwin Reed, an English scholar, has pointed out 885 parallelisms in the Baconian works and the Shakespeare plays, including identical expressions that only the same author could write. Only 5 badly written signatures of Shakespeare exist. The details of his life before he left Stratford and after his retirement are unbelievably petty. There is not one sign of interest by him in the plays. There is not one indication of love of literature or culture. It is extremely unlikely that this uneducated, unlearned actor who knew little Latin and less Greek could have been the author of these literary masterpieces, which a scholar characterized as written in the most courtly, refined, and classical English, replete with learning, full of evidence of wide reading, dealing with aristocratic life and manners, and instinct with poetry of the very highest order. Shakespearean scholars admit that the plays show knowledge of Neoplatonic philosophy, are full of Masonic symbols, knowledge of the ancient world, and an extraordinary vocabulary. Referring to the disparity between the known character of the uneducated Stratford actor and that required for the authorship of the plays, William H. Furness, one of the greatest Shakespearean scholars that has ever lived, says, "I have never been able to bring his life and his plays within a planetary space of each other. The plays and the sonnets, however, harmonize perfectly with the life, character, and attainments and learning of Francis Bacon." The ornament placed at the head of the sonnets in the quarto is also found in Francis Bacon's works, in the Shakespeare plays, and in the King James Version of the Bible. It is a specimen of Rosicrucian symbolism, which at the same time reveals Bacon's true identity. So let's take a look at that. This is the 1611 Authorized King James Bible, which was edited by Francis Bacon, and it's Rosicrucian because we can see the pelican plucking his own breast to feed the young. So for one, if you subscribe to the theory that the King James Bible is the most accurate, legitimate Word of God, then you have to put your faith in Francis Bacon that he was appointed by God to publish this book. So Christians who believe in the King James Bible, regardless of their view on Freemasonry, must admit that Francis Bacon was appointed by God to publish this book. So if we turn to the next page, let's look at the very top here. We've got some flower decorations. And this is more Rosicrucian symbolism. See the rose right here? Zooming in a little bit closer on that, you can see the rose. Just take note to the art style. And let's turn over to Shakespeare, The Taming of the Shrew. And this is also on some of the other ones. But looking up at the top here, and bring them over to Photoshop so we can look at them. Here is the one from the King James Bible. And this one is from Shakespeare. Now, I'll let you be the judge on this, whether or not these two roses are from the same artist or not. But the one on the left is in Shakespeare. Here it is on The Taming of the Shrew. The one on the right, of course, from the King James Bible. So point number 4 is definitely accurate. The ornament placed at the head of the Shakespeare plays appear exactly the same as the ones that are in the King James Version of the Bible. It is a specimen of Rosicrucian symbolism, and that's true. It is the rose. Now, I'll also mention that on this page of the Shakespeare work, it appears to be a map. If you would like detailed information about that, please head over to this video right here, Cracking the Shakespearean Code. Start with part 1. In that video, he cracks some of the Masonic codes hidden in the Shakespeare text and explains exactly why the page number has been fixed right here, otherwise the cipher wouldn't work. But moving on to point number 5, Bacon's De Augmentis, published in Leiden in 1645, contains a frontispiece which is a pictorial allegory. Bacon is seated before a table, pointing with the forefinger of one hand to an open book. The other hand restrains a figure clad in a skin that is struggling to reach a temple at the top of a nearby hill. Bacon is here represented as the author of 2 works, one open and acknowledged, and the other cryptic, dramatic, and unacknowledged. The figure clad in the beast's skin struggling to reach the Temple of Mysteries is the Muse of Tragedy. On the same note, I'm going to mention Gustavi Cellini's book on cryptography, which is from 1624. This appears to be Francis Bacon. And he's passing the hat off to this other guy who's writing. And over here, you've got Shakespeare, because he's holding the spear. And Bacon is handing him a paper. Meanwhile, there's a guy over here blowing the horn. And something's going on up here at night. Someone's making an escape. Is this Francis Bacon's feigned death? Now, Francis Bacon died in 1626. This book was 1624, so 2 years before his death. First, look at the whole title page. On the top is a tempest with flaming beacons. On the left is a gentleman giving something to a spearman, and there are also other figures. On the right is a man on horseback, and at the bottom in a square is a much dressed up man taking the cap of maintenance from a man writing a book. Note that the spearman has a sprig of bay in the hat which he holds in his hand. This man is Shakespeare. He really is a correct portrait of the Stratford householder, which you will readily perceive if you turn to the engraving of Shakespeare's bust. A more detailed analysis of what this frontispiece means can be found in the book Bacon is Shakespeare. The head ornament of the Tempest in the Great Folio and that of Novum Organum are the same. And this one I've been unable to confirm. This is what's at the top of the Tempest. And I could find two frontispieces for Novum Organum. This is one, which shows the two pillars. Looks like Jachin and Boaz. And then the other one is right here. So Francis Bacon, Novum Organum. And this is pretty similar, but it's not the same. So we can see this one in Novum Organum compared to this one at the Tempest. Similar, not the same, that I can see. That ciphers were popular in Queen Elizabeth's day is well known. At least 5 of the ciphers that Bacon used have been deciphered. These ciphers are discovered profusely scattered throughout the plays, sonnets, and ornaments, revealing his name and identity and also his position in the two brotherhoods of the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians. In Donnelly's great cryptogram, the secret story of Bacon's life is revealed, obtained from the cipher message hidden in the Shakespeare folio, describing his authorship of the plays which he turned over to the actor Shakespeare, and how Queen Elizabeth was shocked by the seditious nature of King Richard III, and suspecting that this play was not written by its actor, ordered Shakespeare to be arrested in order to learn from him, under torture, who the real author was. Bacon found out about this and lost all hope, believing that it meant his doom, and in desperation he wished to commit suicide by taking rat poison. However, he saved himself by sending a messenger to Shakespeare, telling him to immediately flee to Holland, which he did, and so the secret was kept. All this was deciphered by Donnelly from the hidden cipher message in the Shakespeare folio, who has learned the code. Since the real purpose of the historical Shakespeare plays was to overthrow the English crown and replace monarchy by democracy by lowering popular respect for the divine rights of royalty, the danger of it becoming known that Bacon was the real author of the plays was so great that Bacon's concealment of his identity was readily understood. In 1530, press censorship was established and continued until 1594. If by chance anything to which Her Majesty took exception happened to find its way into print, the unhappy printer, if he was not broken on the rack or his feet smashed into a bulk, had his hands cut off and the stump seared with hot iron, according to Harold Bailey. A most interesting piece of the direct evidence of the Baconian authorship of the Shakespeare plays is the Shakespeare Monument in Westminster Abbey, which has been erected by the Pope. The statue is graced with the head of Francis Bacon. The stockings are engraved with the Tudor rose and a crown. The lace work on the ruffs of the sleeve is an exact repetition of the ruff worn by Queen Elizabeth. Between his feet are the sonnet initials TT. The fingers of the statue point to the Queen at his side. The place of honor in front is given to a beautiful youth, a crown prince, young Francis Bacon, as the Hilliard miniature. On the left side is a figure of the Queen's second son, the Earl of Essex, and the Queen's husband, the Earl of Leicester. Commenting on this monument, Alfred Dodd, the greatest modern authority on the Shakespeare-Bacon controversy, said, "Think you that the Abbey authorities would have allowed all this apparently meaningless foolery if they had not known to whom the Shakespeare monument was actually being erected? To Lord St. Alban, a prince of the House of Tudor? Not likely. The high dignitaries know the truth as a state secret, and it is known today in the highest quarters." Like the sword of Damocles, the dread secret of his royal birth hovered over Francis Bacon's head. For the moment it was revealed, and jealous aspirants for the throne learned of it, his head would no longer rest on his shoulders, but at the foot of the chopping block. Too great interests were involved, and for this reason he was forced to maintain strict secrecy, both as regards to his authorship of the historical Shakespeare plays and to his later political activities in Freemasonry.